Hello and welcome to Water Stories, the podcast. I'm Eve Barro, and this podcast is a production of BioBAT Art Space. As we embark on each episode, we invite you to immerse yourself in exciting discussions that illuminate the vitality of water, echoing the themes explored by the artists featured in our Brooklyn exhibition on show until June 2025. Enjoy! Today we're talking with Kasia Molga. Kasia Molga is an artist and environmentalist whose work intricately weaves together human emotions with environmental themes, particularly focusing on marine ecosystems. In her exploration, she challenges boundaries using art to probe the deep connections between human experiences and water conservation. Kasia, thank you so much for coming today. I'm really excited for this conversation.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and I am excited to be part of it.
To start off, I was wondering if, as an introduction, you could tell us more about what sparked your interest in marine ecosystem and working around the oceans in general.
So it is quite, if may I say, because it's about me, interesting story. As a child, I grew up traveling with my sailor father on the merchant navy vessels. And the reason for that was that I was born in Poland. Poland during this time was under the communist regime, or whatever you call it. So in general, people couldn't really leave Poland so easily, but in that situation, I had a very bad luck of having a very good luck of having a really morbid case of asthma. And my very clever doctor said that in order for me to survive, I should be on the sea. And then my dad somehow managed to convince the authorities that he could take me with him on board of these big industrial vessels. I was following the school curriculum, being on board of those boats. And then when I was on land, of course, I was passing like little exams, etc., etc. I grew up in that environment of having ocean as my playground. And the water for me, like I didn't have a concept of borders as a kid. I really looked at the earth as a whole thing. And the water was this main connector because there was always a land behind the horizon. And in fact, even now, I have this very childish feeling of the ownership of the ocean. It's my childhood street where I grew up. So hands off, everybody. So yeah, that's how it started. And of course, it's very, I think, unusual upbringing, which sometimes in my adult life, I was like, oh my God, of course, it informs everything I do.
That's so interesting how you're explaining that the ocean is the environment in which you grew up, which I feel like is such a special experience because maybe humans tend to be more terrestrial animals than water-based. And it's so fascinating also the fact that the notion of even borders to you was something that maybe was unfamiliar because you're so used to be on the ocean, which is this really big connector. There's a particular project that you're conducting, which is how to make an ocean that I'm really interested in. And I love that it's also an ocean because you're talking of ocean as maybe this general sort of connector. So yeah, I'd be curious to hear more about this project, how to make an ocean and how it's connected to your relationship with water and the ocean in the first place.
Yes, so you're very right. I specifically used an ocean because I didn't want to focus on one particular part of the earth, but looking at ocean is the largest entity on this planet. But for me, the problem always was how to fall in love with, as Timothy Morton calls it, a hyper object, how to find this intimate relation with it. And my quest in my practice is trying to find for me and then for myself, for other people, that very intimate relation. Maybe for me it is easier because I already have this relation for my upbringing, but I want to convey it to others. And I live on the sea right now as well. And like sea and algae are kind of part of my everyday routine because I go for a very walk, etc. And just before pandemic, when the environmental emergency was declared, and during the same time, the environmental anxiety became like valid mental health condition. During this time, I lost three very close to me people. I grieved a lot. And that, of course, was overlapped with grieving for environment because of that emergency being so highlighted in the news and in the media. And I cried a lot. And I was crying a lot and walking on my local beach. And at some point, I just started thinking about, oh my God, I have so much water coming out of my body. What if I start using it to make a clean marine ecosystem? So that was the kind of beginning, the spark of the idea. And then I was thinking about what can I grow in the tier? Can I translate this big body of an ocean to a mini ocean which we can actually hold? And then what sort of relationship will form with it? And then the pandemic has happened as well. And of course, there was this kind of global anxiety. I suffered from anxiety in general, like I have diagnosed anxiety. So there was more and more tears, and tears also, they became a sort of point of relief, because obviously when I was researching to create this work, I did gigantic research on what makes us cry and what is a component of a tear, etc., etc. And one of the biggest reason of crying is to feel when we feel powerless. But when we cry, we get a clear picture, so we feel this relief. So I started connecting all those research, all those kind of points of departure, and then slowly how to make an ocean grew from there.
And I know this project has different parts. So you explain how it was born and that you then started wondering, okay, what could I grow in this tiny ecosystem but that I'm creating and I'm putting so much care into? Could you expand on the different parts maybe of this project and how it unfolded?
Absolutely. One thing in my practice, and I think it's just me being me, I get distracted too easily. Like when I start researching something, a specific subject for an artwork, I suddenly see 10,000 other things which I want to follow. So luckily during the pandemic, I got the residency with Ars Electronica in Austria from EMAP, which is that organization in Europe connecting artists with various other kind of institutions all over Europe. And the residency was supposed to take, I think, 3 or 6 months, but because of the lockdown, it took 2 years. So I had suddenly this gigantic amount of time to follow all those threads. But I think it was good because, for example, the main idea was to always create like a marine ecosystem, a sort of aquarium or a tiny aquarium, which was made out of my tears. But then when I started, for example, first of all, researching tears, I found out that of course there are many different type of tears. There's tears out of the pain, out of grief, out of feeling powerless, out of anxiety, out of happiness, out of laughter, etc., etc. And all these tears, they contain different proteins and elements which are coming from our body. So for example, when you cry out of pain, those tears, they contain natural opiates. So it's a natural painkiller, which just blown my mind. So of course, I started thinking also whatever I put in my body, whatever I eat, that will be also somehow present in those tears. So then I started thinking about, okay, how can I care about my body? So the tears which I express are the most beneficial to the marine ecosystem which I want to create. And then the next question was like, what sort of marine ecosystem I can host in those tiers? Because there are, of course, ethics about hosting living organisms with a nervous system, for example, etc., etc. I have a friend who is a marine biologist who helped me a little bit with that. And of course, we decided that algae, it's like the most basic organism, but one of the most basic organisms in the seas and oceans. And maybe that would be the best thing to start with. And also algae can grow in enclosed ecosystem. I don't have to have any sort of machinery and filters, etc., 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 to filter the water. So I can have it as an exposition somewhere and don't worry about it. But also when I started collecting my tears, I realized that it's actually extremely difficult because tears, they are, you can scoop them, but they are actually quite thick. So they dry very fast. So then I started thinking, okay, I need to find some tools for me to be able to scoop them. And so then I started thinking about all this journey. And then I'm thinking, okay, what if I cannot cry? What are the cues for me to start crying? I found out, for example, that there are artificial tears, which are made out of the human protein, which you can buy from a super scientific lab. And Ars Electronica helped me to obtain I don't know, it was like 1 nanogram, which would help me to create artificial tears, shall my tears dry out. And so then all this research gave a reason to create 4 parts. So one part is called a lab, when I show all the tools which are needed to create those mini oceans. So that I created a tear, which are like this silver spoon-like device, profiled so they can sit quite easily on human face, and they're like different shapes for different shapes of human cheeks, etc., etc. Then in the lab as well, there are various compositions of this mini ocean. So there is algae, there is a human tear, there's the artificial tear, and there is also a bit of the seawater, because also human tear dries out very fast. So it's very good to dilute it with a bit of the seawater. And then the other thing I was thinking about is how can I test my tears for it to be appropriate for the marine ecosystem? And because during the pandemic, all the labs were closed, I started using the other chemical strips, which you use to test aquarium water. So I started using that to see whether I can have some idea how much, I don't know, potassium is present in my tears, or sulfide, or whatever else you test water for. So that is one part. And another part is called Meteorologist Bot, which is this experience for the member of the audience to come and sense it or experience it in hope that they will cry and they can donate their tears to be part of the project. And that was inspired by 2 facts. So one was, which I mentioned already, what are the cues to make us cry? And the second one, which was very present during this time, and of course it still is, the way how curated news stories made me feel at that time. So basically, you start reading certain stories online, the algorithm gives you the same stories. So we were all reading stories about pandemic, about people dying, about environment dying before that, etc., etc. And then this anxiety, that fear, that sadness was more and more growing. So I designed an AI bot which looks at environmental topics every half an hour, and based on that assesses, if I may say, its mood, and based on that it shows the music and the video which more or less have smaller or bigger cues to make person cry. And so the member of the audience is invited to watch that for 10 minutes, and at the end of it they would cry a little bit. So then they can come out from this space with a tiny tear, give it to the lab. And then the third part is the exposition of all the collected tears in a tiny bottles with a tiny algae, with the date, the reason for crying, the name of the algae. And it's this, I don't know, testament to all those mini oceans which we can create and care for. And on top of that, a year after, a friend of mine, curator from Germany, Jasmin Grimm, invited me to be part of a New Now festival in Essen in Germany. And she really wanted me to make a performance. And I am not a performer at all. I'm not a performance artist. But she was very persuasive. And she said, why don't you make performance workshop, she said. So you can guide people, like guide a group of people to cry. And of course I was like, okay, it's a challenge, I'm going to do it. And so there is like an hour-long ritual where I guide more or less like 10 or 15 people in such a way so that they might cry at the end. So it's part of this work, but sometimes it's separate. But also like it was used by a few institutions to collect tears, so we can make like a special site specific how to make an ocean for them. And I think it was like first time when we did it, it was after the very last lockdown, where everybody started hoping that things will get back to normal. And oh my God, everybody was crying. But I think it was like these tears of relief and also grief, because lots of people lost their dearest during this time.
Yeah, actually, I would be really interested to hear more about this because I think it's very interesting how you mentioned your relationship with the ocean, and you mentioned a lot of different emotions because I think when we started talking about your interest for the ocean, you said that it used to be your playground, something that you play with, that you're so
Yeah.
used to. And then I think you also mentioned maybe grief and eco-anxiety when it comes to the water. And I think it's fascinating how, on one hand, there's this very emotional connection, which is very broad because it goes, as you said, from like joy and being playful to grief and anxiety. And then on the other hand, there's this very interesting sort of almost material relationship with it of thinking that water is always there on our planet because we consume it and then maybe it comes out as tears and then it goes back to our environment. So there's this almost physical connection with our environment, which maybe is also mediated by emotions because we cry. And you also said how there's a lot of different types of tears based on our emotions. So I would love to hear your thoughts on how this project maybe allowed you to highlight the interconnectedness of humans and our ecosystem and our water-based ecosystems, both on a sort of emotional level and an almost physical material level.
Yeah, the first thing which comes to mind, of course, is the hydrofeminism, The Bodies of Water by Astrid Nemesis. And I haven't read the whole book. There's a lot of things which I don't know about the story yet. Like the basic, I think the basic premise is the fact that we are so very connected. The other thing, like recently also, I know that subject was already known in 2014, but I only found out recently that apparently, and it blown my mind as well, water on Earth is older than the sun. I know, right? I just remember about it just before our talk, and I was trying to find the article in some New Scientist to find out what is the proof of that. There's something to do with the hydrogen, which was already present when the sun, the star, have started to form. If you start thinking about it, I don't want to sound too new age, but it's just, of course, we are connected. But I think for me, those interconnections are very intricate and are very different as well. And within the bodies of water, there's so many differences and there's so many currents, and a lot of currents, they go against each other. And there's a toxic water and there is a healthy water, or there's a water which caters for the needs of the corals which live in the cold water. There is the water which caters for us to drink. There is a water which caters for the Great Barrier Reef, etc., etc. And I think when we think about all the water which flows, it's very utopian, but I think we need to have this utopia or utopias in order for us to have hope for the future generation and to be able to act and do something instead of just sitting in the doom gloom scenario and just being hopeless. So I hope in this slightly new age fashion that when we realize that, we embrace those differences as well. And Donna Haraway wrote that to embrace the differences and accept them, it's the most ecological thing. And I think that's super, super important. But also coming back to this interconnectedness and the water in general, as I mentioned before, it is a hyper object. You cannot cuddle a water. Like you cannot become like super personal, intimate with it unless you have a tiny part of it. And I think that was my maybe not conscious thinking about it when I started this project, but some subconscious. Like, how can I make something about oceans which I can actually hold and which depends on me, so that in a way I can change the narrative of us humans being exploiters or observers to servants, because I need to feed this water and look after it and look after this beautiful algae and fall in love with it, and just making sure that I care for this little tiny drop.
I love how even the language that you use reveals, I think, the whole point which you described before, which was to allow people maybe to experience this sort of intimacy with the ocean, because you talked of, yeah, this beautiful algae, these practices of care, how to almost cuddle this water by making it into something that you're able to hold. I think you also used the word hosting the algae. And I think there's something really special also about the fact that you're hosting the algae in biological water, because often when we think of exchange of water between two bodies, maybe it would be through breastfeeding, or it would be really practices of care that are mediated by matter, but really they're also about emotions. So I would love to hear more about your relationship with this algae and maybe how it evolved, how it first started when you started hosting this foreign body, this other, into your sort of biological water, and whether your relationship evolved and how you felt about it.
So the first algae which I hosted was a beautiful red algae, which unfortunately I don't remember the Latin name for right now. But it is quite common algae in the North Hemisphere. I'm on the North Sea, so it's extremely vibrant, especially when you look at it under the microscope. It's like bright pink, it's crazy. And it has this beautiful, intricate, very thin skeleton. And I was like, oh, that's beautiful. I'm going to put it into this tiny bottle and see what happens. And I cry a little bit. I have the tear there as well, and tiny drop of seawater. And after 3 days, it lost color. It became white. And I'm like, oh my God, what happened? So I called my marine biologist friend, and he was like, maybe it needed potassium. So maybe you should eat more banana. So then I started looking at my diet and looking at the proportions of the tear and the seawater, and tried to make sure that the next algae is not going to lose the color and are happy, etc., etc. And of course, because I didn't have access to any kind of medical lab, plus also you would need to find a lab who would be happy to help a crazy artist do weird experiments. And it's not easy normally, and during this time it was almost impossible. I don't have a proven track of what I did and whether I did it. They stayed red, some algae stayed green. They looked nice and happy in those tiny bottles. But you suddenly start being very in tune with that organism you care for. It's like during pandemic, for example, flowers in my house, they were doing amazingly well because we were here all the time. They were all the time in my field of view, in my mode of the perception. So I think that's the key. Like when you start caring for something and you always look at it thoughtfully, you fall in love a little bit with that. That's when those things start to thrive because you really start caring for it.
It's really beautiful thinking how could we be a good friend to the non-human organisms that we interact with, and how to take care of our bodies so that we can be a good friend to them. And you mentioned before how maybe our relationship with what we call nature, or our relationship with other organisms, sometimes is really exploitative, and there's very often no reciprocity. We maybe just extract from others and we don't think of it as a relationship. And it's so interesting when, yeah, the relationship goes maybe the other way, of you thinking, what can I do to best support this other organisms? How can we implement reciprocity in our relationship with non-human and more than human organisms?
I think that the utopian me would say, oh my God, that is the best thing ever. We all should do it. People were doing, for ages, look at the indigenous communities and the way how they respect everything, every entity on this planet. I feel we really need, especially in the Western world, we really need to look back at the wisdom in those communities and see how we can connect all the modern inventions. Like, for example, technology, which of course is not going to solve anything unless we use it wisely. But we have so many tools right now, which people before us didn't have, to be able to connect and understand nature in totally different and new and deeper way. Why don't we use those technologies to actually create this meaningful connection so we can learn something? We have an enormous amount of knowledge on this world. If we can connect it in the wise way, we can be so powerful. For example, also I was thinking about, oh my God, if everybody had a little drop of ocean and 7 billion of people and everybody was caring for it, and then we could just learn from each other, how wonderful it would be. But yeah, of course, it's a total utopia.
Things go slowly, but they do happen. I'm curious also to hear, because you were doing workshops, I'm curious to hear how the audience reacted and whether you had these sorts of conversations with people. And I know you call it utopia, but did this conversation give you hope?
Yes, definitely. Mind you, I also have to stress and keep reminding myself and probably your audience as well that this type of art and this type of thinking, it is also a whim for people who can afford it and people who don't really have. All of us, we have a very serious problems, of course, but I sit in a very comfortable room right now and I'm warm and I have food and I was ill. I could go to hospital. There are wars at the moment. They've been wars. There is a famine. There's a drought somewhere. There's so many tragedies. So it's great when we have a hope in the Western community. It's great that my audience came and they were fascinating and fascinated and happy and responsive. And yes, I had lots of very hopeful and amazing conversation afterwards, and people loved crying. But it is such a small portion. And, but I also hope that through this work, and not only mine work, of course, work of other amazing artists, the audiences, they remember about these other people who are not so fortunate. And we also, when we act, do our things every day for the nature, we also think about them because the nature and everybody, we are all interconnected.
Yeah, and I feel crying is such a basic human experience. And as you said, maybe in this specific context, it's people that would have the capacity to go to this workshop and to decide that they want to be in this emotional state, which so many people don't choose because of the context that they're in. And yeah, I'm wondering if it's also maybe a way to connect with others, because your project is so much about empathy at the end of the day, creating this empathy and making space for it, and maybe allowing individuals to become more aware of this shared human experience. And not only human experience, because I think you were mentioning that the AI program you created was also about looking at environmental news and maybe connecting the individual with more global issues through this human experience of emotions. Do you think the way, that's a very big question, but do you think the way for people to maybe become more even curious or aware of global challenges goes through them feeling very intimately connected to those challenges through the emotions that they might feel in this context?
Yeah, it is a big question. And of course, I can only answer it from very subjective point of view. But I've been always trying for myself, first of all, to feel empathy and respect and love towards those big hyper objects, towards nature, towards other societies or whatever, towards water. And I think that very often I come from the position of the observer, and everything, like I read a research paper on something and everything is very scientifically rigorous and true. And for example, this research about something which will happen during the climate change in certain region, let's say when the temperature is going to go up that and that amount of degrees. And you read it and then you feel, yeah, it's bad. But I feel I'm still an observer. So even though I know it's bad, it doesn't really affect me as much as that very personal and intimate approach. And so I think for me, that allowance to first of all show my own emotional vulnerability, permit other to dig inside, to bring it up as well. And that creates then the space for empathy and grief and connection and sadness and community. And I think when we all then feel connected, human and non-human, I think that's the way forward for me.
I think that's very inspiring last words. This idea of trying to make space for connection, as mundane or important it might be, and leaving it open for the different individuals in the space to connect in the way they want to, and also taking account for the non-human individuals that we might want to connect to. I think that's really inspiring. Kasia, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode. We hope you enjoyed it. You can find all of our other episodes online on our platforms, as well as in our listening room in our exhibition space in Brooklyn, New York. Bye!